In May 2024, during the Lennart Meri Conference in Tallinn, Estonia, a stunning announcement sent shockwaves through the international security community. The three Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, declared their readiness to deploy 300,000 troops to Ukraine, stating, "We cannot wait for NATO." At first glance, this declaration might sound like a scenario straight out of a military adventure novel, where tiny knights dare to challenge the giant dragon of the Russian Federation. However, the Baltic countries appeared deadly serious, arguing that if Moscow prevailed on the Ukrainian battlefield, they would be the next victims. The question arises, should President Putin genuinely worry about a force from three nations with a combined population of only 6 million? Or is this merely a political bluff designed to pressure NATO and the EU into taking stronger action? In the context of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, which shows no signs of abating, any spark could ignite a larger conflagration, reshaping the entire European and even global security order. Geographically, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are nestled along the Baltic Sea, with modest land areas and populations smaller than some major cities in Asia. Yet, their proximity to Russia comes with a tumultuous history. Decades of annexation under the Soviet Union, followed by hard-won independence in 1991. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was seen by the Baltic nations as a tipping point, threatening not only Eastern Europe's security, but also exposing the Kremlin's ambitions to expand its influence. On the surface, the claim of 300,000 Baltic troops ready for deployment might sound humorous, akin to a plucky underdog standing up for justice. But such half-serious, half-strategic declarations often carry significant weight. They signal resolve while simultaneously placing major powers under pressure to act decisively against Moscow. This scenario echoes the paradoxical dynamics of geopolitics, where stronger nations hesitate to confront adversaries openly, while smaller ones boldly step forward to protect their interests. To grasp the full scope of this development, we must step back and examine the Baltic region's deep-seated anxieties. Why would Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania stir such waves? Are they so desperate that they feel compelled to challenge Russia despite the risks? Or are they leveraging this move to provoke a response from NATO and bolster the defense posture along Europe's eastern flank? In the following analysis, we will delve into the turbulent history, military context, and the Baltic nations' calculated maneuvers, both overt and covert. Most importantly, we will consider whether President Putin should switch to red alert or merely shrug off the talk of 300,000 toy soldiers with a smirk. To address the critical question, why are Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania demonstrating such a firm stance? The Baltic region shares a turbulent and deeply fraught historical relationship with Russia. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the territories now known as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were repeatedly annexed by the Russian Empire. From 1918 to 1920, they briefly gained independence but were forcibly absorbed by the Soviet Union in 1940, amidst the chaos of World War II. The Sovietization of the Baltic region left a bitter legacy. Tens of thousands were deported, and Moscow imposed strict control over local culture, language, and economy. This nightmare ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the three Baltic nations emerged as independent states with a steadfast mantra: never return to Russia's embrace. The Baltic states' aversion to Russia runs even deeper than that of other Eastern European nations. While countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary maintain complex economic and political ties with Moscow, the Baltic states have severed almost all connections to ensure their security. Their determination to join NATO in 2004, even at the risk of provoking Russia, underscores their commitment to the Atlantic Alliance's protective umbrella. However, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 served as a wake-up call for the Baltic nations, exposing NATO's perceived sluggishness and lack of assertiveness. Key NATO members like Germany, France, Italy, and Spain were cautious, wary of escalating tensions. Heavy weapon transfers were delayed, and Ukraine was even restricted from using Western weapons to strike Russian territory. The Baltic states, in stark contrast, believed in a more aggressive approach. To survive, you must fight to the end, leaving no room for Russia to recover or expand. This divergence in strategy led Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to adopt a bolder tone. If Russia were to fully conquer eastern Ukraine, they too would mobilize. Their declaration was not only a direct warning to Moscow, but also a calculated move to pressure NATO into taking stronger action. This is a high-stakes political gamble designed to show powers like the US and Germany that if they fail to decisively stop Russia, the Baltic states are prepared to act, no matter the consequences. Naturally, international observers, especially those with a sense of humor, might chuckle at the idea. How could these tiny countries muster 300,000 troops? But it's worth noting that the Baltic states are ramping up defense spending to 3% of GDP, reintroducing conscription, expanding reserve forces, and stockpiling weaponry. While sustaining 300,000 troops for the long term may be unrealistic, a short-term mobilization could act as a strategic surprise. Their mindset remains clear. It's better to defend at a distance than to let war reach your doorstep. When considering the figure of 300,000 troops, one can't help but wonder, are the Baltic states exaggerating to deter their adversaries? In geopolitics, inflating the scale of military strength is not uncommon. Take North Korea, for instance, which has repeatedly claimed it could mobilize millions to confront the United States, although many of these soldiers were likely untrained farmers or industrial workers. So, how many troops can the Baltic nations realistically muster? Share your thoughts below. The Baltic states do possess a certain military foundation, small but disciplined and aligned with NATO standards. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have all deployed troops for international missions in Afghanistan and Iraq alongside Western allies, demonstrating their capacity for coordinated combat operations. They also maintain reserve forces, civilians given basic training, but with a strong sense of patriotism and national defense. Historically, the Baltic peoples have shown remarkable determination to resist Russian control, willing to do whatever it takes to secure their independence. Economically, despite their modest GDPs, these nations are significantly increasing defense spending. According to The Conversation, March 2024, each Baltic state is allocating 3% of GDP to military expenditures, surpassing NATO's recommended 2%. Estonia is constructing 600 bunkers slated for completion in 2025, Latvia has reinstated conscription, and Lithuania is collaborating with Germany to station 4,800 troops along its border with Russia by 2027. These initiatives suggest that while the number 300,000 may seem ambitious, the Baltic states are not making empty threats. They are investing resources, stockpiling ammunition, mobilizing reserves, and training territorial defense units to prepare for worst-case scenarios. If they decide to intervene in Ukraine, they won't be deploying symbolic forces. Their actions would be well calculated. The critical question remains, how far are they willing to go? And will NATO provide the necessary backing? NATO itself faces a dilemma. Article 5 of its charter states that an attack on one member is an attack on the entire alliance. However, if the Baltic states proactively enter Ukraine and face Russian retaliation on Baltic soil, would Article 5 automatically apply? In theory, a Russian attack on NATO territory would trigger collective defense. Yet, some might argue, the Baltic states provoked this by attacking Russia on Ukrainian soil. This could lead to divisions within NATO, especially among more cautious members like Germany and France, who prefer to avoid escalation. In the worst-case scenario, the Baltic states might rely on NATO for protection, but NATO's hesitation could lead to a collapse. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania could become easy targets for a military punishment from Moscow. However, if NATO turns a blind eye and allows the Baltic states to be attacked, the alliance's credibility would be utterly destroyed. This is the classic catch-22 that the Baltic states are skillfully exploiting. So, should Putin be worried? On one hand, the 300,000 troops from the Baltic states might just be an empty threat. But on the other hand, if Moscow becomes complacent and the Baltic states truly send troops to Ukraine, the battlefield dynamics could change dramatically. Russia would no longer have the luxury of focusing solely on eastern Ukraine. It would have to watch its northern flank, where Poland, the Baltic states, and Belarus are all waiting for an opportunity. From the Baltic perspective, a preemptive strike in Ukraine is better than having to fight to the death at home. It's similar to a chess game. Instead of waiting for the opponent to encircle the board, the player chooses to attack first, forcing the opponent to defend on their own territory. Everyone knows that holding ground on someone else's turf is far less risky than fighting for survival in one's own backyard. Next, let's delve deeper into the strategy behind the Baltic states' announcement that they are ready to send troops to Ukraine. It's clear they have two main objectives. First, forcing the West to take stronger action. From the beginning of the conflict, NATO powers have been cautious, prohibiting Ukraine from striking Russian territory with Western weapons. The Baltic states want to change that stance because they believe that unless Moscow is decisively dealt with, it will continue initiating conflicts after it secures eastern Ukraine. A bold declaration like this forces the US, Germany, the UK, and France to reconsider. If we're afraid of escalation, we should worry even more about the Baltic. They might act recklessly, dragging us into the conflict regardless. Second, increasing the Baltic region's influence. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, often seen as a peripheral zone with little say in the EU and NATO compared to major powers, are now seizing the opportunity to become political focal points. Their decisiveness has drawn the world's attention. Wow, these small countries dare to challenge Russia head-on. This attention could bring increased military, financial, and infrastructural support from the alliance, turning the Baltic region into a vital frontline defense. Of course, this kind of carp turning into a dragon transformation comes with significant risks. If Russia loses its temper and launches a direct attack on Estonia or Latvia, while NATO hesitates, the Baltic states will be the first to suffer devastating losses. That's why they're betting everything on the belief that NATO, no matter what, wouldn't dare abandon them. Doing so would forever tarnish the alliance's reputation. As for President Putin, if he dismisses the Baltic states as merely wielding a wooden sword, he may choose to ignore or counter-threaten them. But if he's wrong, and these nations act boldly, Russia's military will be forced to spread its resources across multiple fronts, complicating the situation in Ukraine. This is precisely the pincer move the Baltic states aim to create, forcing Moscow to divide its focus and preventing it from concentrating all its forces on Ukraine. A crucial point: Baltic soldiers are trained to NATO standards, possess modern combat strategies, and are particularly adept at countering Russia's hybrid tactics, including electronic warfare, cyber attacks, and heavy artillery barrages. In numerous NATO exercises, Baltic units have consistently excelled in defense and anti-infiltration scenarios. That said, it's worth noting that 300,000 raw recruits, if mobilized hastily, including newly conscripted civilians, may not perform effectively. Deploying them to an unfamiliar battlefield, coordinating with Ukrainian forces, and overcoming language barriers are significant challenges. On the other hand, if NATO supplies advanced weaponry, Leopard tanks, PZH-2000 howitzers, shoulder-launched missiles, even if the troops' quality is not top tier, they could still exert considerable pressure on Russia. Could Russia launch a preemptive strike on the Baltic region to eliminate this threat? Such a scenario would be a nightmare, as NATO might interpret it as an official act of aggression, triggering Article 5. Even if the Baltic states talk big, Putin must calculate, attacking the Baltic means declaring war on NATO. This highlights the Baltic states' bold gamble. They believe Russia won't dare swallow them outright for fear of clashing with NATO. If Russia fires the first shot, the US, UK, France, and other NATO members could not claim it's none of their business. The alliance's credibility and responsibilities would force them to intervene. In essence, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are using NATO's name as a shield to make provocative declarations. Their reasoning is clear. Russia wouldn't dare attack us because it fears total war. We're free to flex our muscles, but if Russia wins in Ukraine, we're doomed anyway, so we might as well preemptively intimidate them. However, in geopolitics, nothing is guaranteed. There is always the risk of miscalculation. If Putin is cornered or if internal conflict arises within the Kremlin, a hardline faction might press the button to attack, and the Baltic states could pay a devastating price. From an economic and social perspective, what would happen if the Baltic states go all in? Clearly, mobilizing a large-scale force would place enormous strain on the budgets of the three nations, which are already limited. Citizens would have to leave their jobs to join the military, disrupting the economy, increasing inflation, and causing significant social upheaval. Moreover, if the conflict spreads to the Baltic region, critical infrastructure like ports, roads, and housing could be destroyed. These countries rely heavily on tourism, services, and technology, rather than being industrial defense powerhouses. Going all out to fight Russia may sound impressive, but it comes with immense risks of devastated homelands if the conflict escalates. That said, the Baltic peoples may be willing to sacrifice to stop Russia early. They see Ukraine as the front line. If Ukraine falls, they will have to face the formidable Russian army directly on their borders. Since 2022, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have supported Ukraine with financial aid, weapons, and assistance, often contributing more relative to GDP than many Western European nations. An intriguing detail: the Russian-speaking communities in the Baltic states pose a potential internal conflict. In Latvia and Estonia, the proportion of ethnic Russians is significant. If the Baltic governments call for full mobilization, will these Russian-speaking citizens comply, or will they turn their backs, perhaps even informing Moscow? This could become a critical vulnerability in the strategy to mobilize 300,000 troops. So should President Putin be cautious? From a military logic perspective, the answer is yes. Even though the Baltic states are small, they are NATO members, bordering Russia, and highly determined. Any miscalculation by Moscow could lead to a large-scale confrontation, resulting in further sanctions and losses for Russia. Moreover, while Russia is significantly stronger than the Baltic states, it is currently bogged down in Ukraine. Its combat capacity, morale, and logistics are being worn down. Opening a new front could indeed lead to Russia's economic and military collapse. Although Russia still holds the energy card, cutting off gas and oil supplies to Europe has gained experience in finding alternative sources after the 2022 to 2023 crisis. To what extent should caution be exercised? Moscow might increase its deterrence measures, such as conducting military drills near the Baltic borders, deploying Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad, launching cyber attacks, and using propaganda to pressure the governments of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The goal would be to make them hesitate before actually sending troops to Ukraine. This game leans heavily on psychology and diplomacy. Even if the Baltic states don't immediately deploy 300,000 troops, they have already succeeded in disrupting the situation and forcing Russia to respond. Meanwhile, international public opinion is abuzz, putting pressure on NATO and pushing the West toward more decisive support for Ukraine. In a historical context, the story of the 300,000 Baltic troops continues the tradition of the small daring to stand against the big. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania stood together during their escape from the Soviet Union. They share a three brothers mentality in confronting a giant adversary. Today, they face a new challenge: Putin's Russia, still driven by Soviet revivalist ambitions, regardless of international law. From a media perspective, the Baltic Declaration also serves as a form of public manipulation to thrust themselves into the spotlight. International media outlets are buzzing with questions like, will they actually go to war? Regardless of the answer, the Baltic states have succeeded in drawing Europe's attention and pulling NATO into the debate. If we compare this to the theatrics North Korea and Russia have displayed, such as the shocking handshake between Kim Jong-un and Putin, the Baltic states are employing a similar tactic of shock value to alter the board. The difference is that the Baltic states are NATO members with substantial backing, whereas North Korea, despite its large army, remains isolated and impoverished, making it difficult to sustain long-term action. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania believe that, with their shared boat alongside NATO, they have a chance to rally Western powers to push back against Russia before they must face a direct confrontation at the gates of Riga, Tallinn, or Vilnius. Whether this strategy is wise or reckless depends on the reactions of all parties involved. Finally, we must ask, what will be the ultimate outcome of the 300,000 Baltic troops scenario? Will the Baltic states actually send a large-scale force to Ukraine, or is this merely a case of empty posturing? Let's consider some potential scenarios. First, Scenario 1. The Baltic states stop at making threats to pressure NATO and the EU into sending more weapons to Ukraine. If the West significantly increases its support, and Russia is either pushed back or held at bay, the Baltic states would achieve their goal without shedding any blood. Second, another scenario. The situation in Ukraine worsens, Russia gains more territory, and the Baltic states make up their minds to send troops, possibly in rotating groups, totaling hundreds of thousands over time. In this case, the conflict would escalate dramatically, Russia would be caught in a difficult position, and NATO would face the critical question, will we intervene if Russia retaliates against Baltic territory? Lastly, Scenario 3. The Baltic states launch an actual attack, but are intercepted by Russia and forced to retreat. NATO is divided and fails to intervene promptly. The result? The Baltic states suffer severe devastation, while Russia also incurs significant losses, leading to an even more serious European security crisis. Overall, Scenario 1 is the safest option for both the Baltic states and Europe. Scenarios 2 and 3, however, are fraught with risks. Everything depends on the developments on the Ukrainian battlefield. If Ukraine strengthens its position and stops Russia's expansion, the Baltic states might not have to take such a reckless step. What other scenarios might be possible? Share your thoughts in the comments below. In summary, these potential scenarios are precisely why President Putin and Russia's military leaders are facing a headache. They can neither ignore the Baltic threat nor go all in against it, as the risk of facing NATO is too great. Despite being a military superpower, Russia has no desire for a direct confrontation with the world's most powerful alliance. On a satirical note, some might say, the three Baltic states are like three little squirrels baring their claws to threaten the Russian bear. But these squirrels have a giant relative, NATO, standing behind them, forcing the bear to tread carefully. This creates a new atmosphere of tension, deliberately provoking the Kremlin. Many commentators joke that Putin has probably lost a few nights of sleep since hearing about the Baltics' game plan, though this is, of course, an exaggeration. Still, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania's open declaration of their willingness to send troops to Ukraine serves as a psychological trigger, forcing Russia to divide its focus. On the flip side, if the Baltic states miscalculate, they could become cannon fodder for Moscow, a scenario reminiscent of North Korea sending second-rate soldiers to Russia in Kim Jong-un's wild proposal. However, the Baltic states and North Korea are worlds apart in terms of context, alliances, and capabilities. The Baltic states are not weak and impoverished like some North Korean forces. They adhere to NATO training standards, have market economies, and their citizens are well educated. The lesson learned. Sometimes the balance of power lies in the willingness of the small to take bold risks, forcing the powerful to tread carefully. Of course, the level of boldness is where the art lies. If the Baltic states recklessly disregard all consequences, they could bring disaster upon themselves. But if they maneuver wisely, they could turn the declaration of 300,000 troops into an effective political card, deterring Russia while solidifying their position within NATO and the EU. We've journeyed through a comprehensive analysis, examining the historical animosity between the Baltic states and Russia, military capabilities, defense strategies, NATO relations, political calculations, and potential scenarios for the future. All of this revolves around one central question. 300,000 Baltic troops ready to advance. Should President Putin be worried? The answer? Yes. Putin cannot ignore this. Even if the figure of 300,000 troops is an exaggeration, the determination and political context of the Baltic states create a significant threat. Moreover, the Baltic states do not stand alone. They are NATO members, part of a defensive alliance with the United States, the world's most powerful nation. This is a prime example of modern European geopolitics. Small nations plus high determination, strong allies equals power that exceeds their actual scale. Despite Russia's might, already bogged down in Ukraine, it is unlikely to open another front without significant risk. So, will the 300,000 Baltic troops eventually march into Ukraine? Or is this merely a bluff to pressure NATO and Russia? Perhaps even Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius have not made a final decision. But one thing is certain, just announcing this possibility has already heated up the situation in Eastern Europe. It sets a precedent. When small nations feel their survival is at stake, they are willing to act first without waiting for collective agreement. From here, the conflict in Ukraine may enter a new phase, where Russia's neighboring countries take more proactive steps. Europe's fate hangs on a fragile thread of escalation, and all eyes are on the next moves from both Moscow and the Baltic states. If you're curious about who will emerge as the winner in this geopolitical chess game, no one dares to predict with certainty. Perhaps the 300,000 Baltic troops will remain mere rhetoric, or perhaps they will truly step onto the battlefield in Ukraine, pulling off an unexpected upset. Either way, President Putin must stay cautious, at least strategically, because sometimes the small can inflict greater damage than expected. What do you think about this shocking declaration? Are the Baltic states talking big to intimidate, or will they truly deploy an army as vast as ants to Ukraine if Russia gains the upper hand? Share your thoughts, and let's watch how this geopolitical game unfolds in the coming months.